Thank you everyone for being here. And Hector was a great presentation. Loved every second of it. Um, Hector and I actually go to school together. We are in the master's program at Cal State Long Beach. This is our second year. And what I focus on is mostly gender, sexuality, and queer histories. I really like looking at histories of the body and how the body politic interacts with cultural history and cultural meanings of queer people. Um, Today, I wanted to talk about the San Diego Blood Sisters. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So the San Diego Blood Sisters is the main group that I wanted to highlight during this presentation and in my research. Mostly, they are a group of women activists who were prominent and active during the AIDS epidemic. So before I get too far into the presentation, I do want to give a slight roadmap just to keep the following along and let you know where we're going to go with this conversation. So first, I'll talk about the topic in general and the reasons why I actually chose it. We'll talk a little bit about my sources. I'll read you my thesis statement and put it up here just so you know the core argument that I'm planning on arguing and did argue in my paper. We'll go over some of the table of contents and a brief overview of each of the arguments. And then I'll end with the significance of why this project is really important. Okay, so first, the topic and the reasons. So a lot of times when we talk about queer history, at least when I was growing up, and I know it's a little bit different here in California, I actually grew up in Texas, and we didn't really hear a whole lot about queer people as I was growing up. The first time I really started to hear about queer history and about the queer community was when I went to college. And so for me, that feels like a little bit too late. And even in California or other progressive states, the history of the queer community, it really focuses on three major themes: Stonewall, the massive death toll because of AIDS, and then Obergefell versus Hodges, which is the Supreme Court case that declared gay marriage across the United States. So this is really a limiting version of history that we are offered and that we get to know queer people. And so what I wanted to do was showcase a moment of queer solidarity. Throughout my life, I've been told that the queer women and queer men, or gay men and lesbian women, don't really get along because they are at odds. And at times in the history and in the historical literature, they can sometimes appear that way. But really, I'd like to showcase a moment and showcase why we are a community and why this coalition can work. And so this is, the Blood Sisters are an example, a shining example of that queer solidarity. Oftentimes when we are discussing queer history, as many topics in history in general, women are pushed to the margins. And so I'd like to recenter women into the middle. That way we can get a little bit more of a holistic understanding of the queer community and what these women really meant to us as a people. So how did I get here to the Blood Sisters and why the Blood Sisters? I actually had never heard of the Blood Sisters up until like very beginning of this year. And I saw them first on a herstory TikTok on in TikTok about the Blood Sisters. It was just going through like really quickly who they are. And it really sparked interest in me of, we don't hear about these women. We don't hear about the queer women that really changed the community. Some of us know the adage that the L comes before G because of lesbian women, but we don't necessarily understand the historical context behind that. And that's really important to understand when we talk about the queer community and when we educate more people on this vibrant community that is a part of America and beyond. But originally, my topic was going to look at the moral majority and Anita Bryant's cultural effects on the queer community, but I decided to shift because the Blood Sisters tell a much more interesting story. I don't necessarily want to focus on all of the discrimination that we experience, but I want to focus on our activism. How do we reclaim our bodies? How do we reclaim our cultural narrative and push for a more queer and more visible queer community? Before I move on to, I'd like to talk a little bit about San Diego. San Diego is a site of queer history and a site of queer women's involvement specifically. So locating these women within San Diego first actually makes a whole lot of sense. It's not necessarily the first place people think of a queer hub or of a gay hub. Most people think of San Francisco, New York, sometimes LA, but San Diego is actually up there, and it's one of the more prominent places, both because of the Navy and prominent queer figures that were very active in the social life. Ever since the 1880s, there have been many different prominent real estate associates and real estate owners in San Diego who were queer, as well as in the early 1900s, many women who were involved in the museums, the parks, and essentially the social life of San Diego. And so it just makes a little bit more sense as to why in the 1980s, the Blood Sisters, ACT UP San Diego, and a little bit more of that queer activism that we're going to talk about, built on this legacy of queerness in San Diego. I also want to make the note that I use the term queer mostly because it is an umbrella term. A lot of times you'll see the words gay and lesbian, as well as bisexual or transgender and more. I use queer as an umbrella term, but I also use it because when we're talking about these women, there are many different kinds of being queer. There's not just one way to be, essentially, no one way to be gay. So to encompass everybody, I would use this term more often. It also shows more of the gender variances that people didn't necessarily recognize all of the time. This brings us to my thesis statement. So starting in the summer of 1983, lasting through the 1990s, Wendy Sue, who is a blood sister, along with several other lesbian and queer women from the San Diego Democratic Club, formed the San Diego Blood Sisters. These women inspired other lesbian and queer women's blood drives across the nation, served their community, and established queer-centric directed donation accounts, and built on a network of unity and solidarity within the queer community. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, but essentially what I'm saying here is I wanted to highlight how these women really got involved. I wanted to highlight where they started, what they created, and who they inspired and how they inspired us to move on. And so within this statement, within this argument, I'm really getting at that core of how did these women impact our community to build that unity and build that solidarity? But where does it go beyond that? So first, taking a little bit of a step back, I wanted to talk about the primary sources that I used. There were two major archives, and if you haven't looked at queer-centric archives or you haven't seen many before, they are there. And so I really recommend people getting involved with these archives and getting involved with the queer communities resources, because then it allows us to do more of this research. The two major ones that I used are LA and San Diego based, the One Archives in Los Angeles at USC, and the Lambda Archives, which is based in San Diego. There are a few different interviews because many of the Blood Sisters are actually still alive. When we think about the past, it feels very distant. And when we talk about history, most of the time, it feels like it's been a long time. But the 1980s wasn't that long ago. It was only 40 years ago. So when we put that into context, many of these people are still alive. Many of these women who impacted this community are still here, and we can hear from them. We can understand their stories, and we can talk to them directly. One way that we do this is through oral history interviews. And so Wendy Sue Bageleisen has a really great one on the Lambda Archives website. I also focused a lot on the polls from newspapers. This was because it shows the dominant feelings or the dominant culture's feelings, and the dominant culture being white, heteronormative, cisgendered, these kind of aspects that were controlling the narrative of the 1980s. And so on the left here, you see a Blood Sisters blood drive flyer. And this one actually showcases how far reaching the Blood Sisters were. So this wasn't just located in San Diego, it started in San Diego, but then they moved beyond that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then on the right here, this showcases the kinds of polls that were taken in the newspapers and in the 1980s. And so some of these are really quite discriminatory when you read them. So require AIDS tests for job seekers, when we think about being employed in this country, we don't necessarily think about all of the restrictions that could be placed on us. And so this is a really great reminder that in the 1980s, we did face a lot of this discrimination as queer people, and that this discrimination is possible. Um, and so it just makes us a little bit more mindful of why we need legal protections and why we need to have these conversations in general. Some of the secondary sources that I used, they're mostly contextual sources and some historiographical works that did start talking a little bit about the Blood Sisters and the way that queer women got involved. So the contextual sources really allow us to a greater look into the 1980s and how this society was formed and how the society interacted with each other. And then my historiographical works by Jennifer Breyer and Beth Hutchinson, I really want to make sure that they get a call out here because they were the grounding sources for me in this discussion outside of the primary sources. They did do a lot of work on kind of creating or starting that narrative of what is an AIDS service and what is AIDS activism, and how does that have to do with our bodies? And in that last point, how this has to do with our bodies and how this has to do with building more of a queer community is where I kind of lean in a little bit more. So for my table of contents, I have first is through context. So what is the backdrop of the US culture and the discrimination against the queer community? And my two main arguments are one, the Blood Sisters. Here they are, they're super important. Why do we need to talk about them? And then my second argument is this is a movement. It's not just a moment of activism. So I'll get into that a little bit more as we discuss. But in the 1980s, this Reagan era ideology created a lot of social conservatism, which created discrimination against the queer community in two phases. First was the traditional values, which is spurred by the Christian right. The Christian right being kind of like that moral majority, Anita Bryant, Reagan in and of himself. And these kind of traditional values meant heteronormativity, it meant whiteness, it meant straight, it meant all of these kind of aspects that we think about in discrimination now as well. And then the AIDS, which has two subphases, the kind of AIDS discrimination that went along in the 1980s. So first, there was the ignoring of the existence of AIDS, which caused many queer people to be negatively impacted, and they did not have the resources that they needed from the get-go, because there was no acknowledgement that this was affecting people as well as queer people and people of color. So after that first wave of ignoring, then there came the outright blame of a disease on Black people and queer peoples. So it's almost like they flipped their tune once they noticed that this was really affecting the queer community. They had someone to blame. So then we get to the Blood Sisters. They are a group of lesbian and queer women activists who created directed blood donation accounts. They started lesbian and queer women's blood drives, and they really got involved in their communities through ACT UP San Diego and Clean Needle projects. I really want to stress how important these direct blood donation accounts were and the blood drives in themselves, because queer men did not have the access to blood that they needed to survive AIDS. We all know by now the trope that HIV and AIDS is a queer man's disease or a gay man's disease. That has long been told to us. But queer women really did help. They really did step in by creating these directed blood donation accounts. Directed blood donation accounts were then used where queer women could say, my blood is going to one person. It is going to this queer person. This gay person is getting my blood. And that was really powerful because it created this moment of solidarity where our bodies, our blood is changing the life of another person. It's helping them to live a little bit longer. And so I really want to make sure that we stress that point. I don't want to let that go by the wayside, because queer women's involvement in that allowed for more discussions. It allowed for a greater queer community to continue existing. Beyond those blood drives, getting involved in ACT UP San Diego and Clean Needle projects, these are two other ways that queer women really stepped up and really continued to fight for that queer liberation from the 1970s. And so this kind of ACT UP San Diego and the Clean Needle projects, they did go against directive orders, and they went against state and federal legislatures to make sure that people on the street were getting the help that they need. Because queer women really recognized and really pushed that this is not a gay man's disease. This is not something that just affects queer people. It affects everybody. And one of the biggest ways that we know that AIDS is transmitted or HIV is transmitted is through sharing needles. And so providing clean needles to people who are experiencing homelessness or other peoples who are affected by drug use and could be at a higher risk for HIV and AIDS, they recognized this and said, okay, we need to step in. We need to make sure that they have access to not get this disease. And so their effects, these women's effects in San Diego, really influenced and spread the drives across the nation. As I showed you a little bit earlier in the primary sources, there was a flyer that said it was from Long Beach. There were Long Beach activists happening the Long Beach blood drives, as well as LA, New York, Chicago, and other places. So this really was not a small and isolated moment. It was across the United States. This organization lasted for more than 10 years. And they continued doing these blood drives and blood donation accounts for more than 10 years. And this just goes to show how it's a queer women's movement. It's not just one moment in time. The Blood Sisters really were building on an already happening conversation, and a conversation that continued after them. One way that we know this is through the Gay Community News, the GCN. A lot of queer people were subscribed to the Gay Community News, which featured Cindy Patton and Eugenia Buzo. And both of these women are really active and really steadfast in the beliefs that AIDS activism is queer activism, and that sexual liberation, the ideas that were founded in the 1970s liberationist movement, are how we continue being a queer community. And so beyond the Gay Community News, The Advocate, which is a queer-centric magazine and essentially kind of like a newspaper, they published a lot of queer-centric and gay polls, gay news, queer news, and the things that were happening in the community. And so these two platforms really expanded on the Blood Sisters, and the Blood Sisters expanded on them. As a queer community and queer outlets, they made sure that everything was intertwined. When the Blood Sisters were doing their blood drives, they made sure that both the gay news and the straight news were there. And that's from their own words, which is really interesting to kind of think about and to talk about, because this was a moment, and these are many moments where our movement, our queer movement, is looking to expand and looking for that recognition. And that's a really important thing when we're considering what is AIDS activism and what is AIDS services. Jennifer Breyer brings this up in her book, Infectious Ideas, and she really separates these two ideas. But I'd like to kind of combine them a little bit more. I think that any time that we are providing AIDS services is a moment of AIDS activism. Because these two things cannot be separated in my mind, they work together. And the ways that they do this are through examples like the Blood Sisters. The Blood Sisters were providing an AIDS service. They were donating their blood. They were sitting at hospitals with AIDS patients. They were taking care of gay men who were dying. That's a service. But it's also an incredible amount of activism. They're putting their bodies into positions of risk. They're putting their blood into a position of power. They're asserting their power through their body. And that is activism. And it's one way that we combine these two ideas. Most of the time when people talk about AIDS activism, they're talking about ACT UP, and they're talking about those clean needle projects, but they forget that those people who were part of this were also the ones doing the AIDS services. And so we can't separate these two ideas. We have to have them together. And there are a lot of different cultural and political effects to the queer women's movement that was really getting going and pushing against the norm in both the gay community as well as the straight community. And so by having these kind of moments of activism and moments of and like pushing for more activism, we kind of get to this significance idea. The Blood Sisters reasserted that our sexuality does not limit us. They built on that idea of gay liberation, sexual liberation. Our bodies have power. And that's something that was really important to remember and really important to think about when we think about a movement and a social movement that is founded within bodies that continues to fight against an oppressive narrative. And this really did ground the community in a liberation of the body. We see this even now. We talk a lot about in the queer kind of news and queer kind of discourse, we talk a lot more about trans bodies, but we're talking a lot about queer bodies. And so where does this come from? This comes from the 1970s. This comes from the 1980s when women's groups really pushed for their bodies to continue being a liberatory space. It also highlights how queer women were asserting narratives of unity and solidarity. So that additive or that adjective of the L coming before the G because of this, it is true. And it is a reason, it is something that we, need to consider, but we need to consider the cultural and political effects of it. We need to consider that there is a greater understanding of the cultural ties between the queer community, the coalition that we have because of queer women.
Hey, Zach, great, thank you. I'm glad one of the resources that you used was the One Archive,
Yeah.
because they're phenomenal. I actually did a presentation once with Joseph Hawkins when he was still the executive director,
Oh, that's
and
so awesome.
he pointed out to me that the fact that there was an archive like that at all
Yeah.
was nothing short of miraculous, because so much of the queer history was forbidden.
Yeah.
It was forbidden by law, it was forbidden by custom and practice, and absolutely every other measurement you can think of, which I don't think which I think this is just me expressing myself, is that's something that the younger generation, maybe of your age group, is probably the first group to really understand and appreciate the value of of that history, because it's there now.
Yeah.
If you go back 30, 40, 50 years, you probably don't you don't have that. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because the fact that that kind of history is now available, it cannot be denied. It is being added on, and it is actually informing the discussions, like the one we're having about bodily autonomy,
Yeah.
whatever form that happens to be. And let's see, a couple of other
Yeah.
notes of mine.
I mean, the ability that we even have the chance that we even have the ability to talk about it is something that I don't take for granted. And I think a lot of us who are coming into this queer conversation are really thankful for, because we are building on groups like the Blood Sisters. We're building on groups that made sure to keep their notes, keep their information. That way
Yes.
we could tell their information. We could
Tell their stories. Tell their stories. Do the oral interviews. Get them written down.
Yeah.
Get them all out there for the rest of us, especially us older types, because there's so much that we still have to learn.
There's a lot to learn regardless. I think everybody, especially with communities like as even Hector mentioned, the Brown Berets and the queer community, and these minority groups and people who are discriminated against, our stories aren't told. And so we do need to have the ability to kind of say why we matter, why we exist, but also show that we've always existed. We've always mattered.
Yes.
We've always been here. And so understanding that fact that have always been here and we will always be here allows for a better, more, well-rounded understanding of history, as well as a more well-rounded understanding of ourselves. Because like I said, I mean, I hadn't even heard of the Blood Sisters. I hadn't even heard of most queer and gay liberation until I went to college. And so these ideas are really important for people who are queer and people who are of a minority group to see themselves in the literature and see themselves in society.
And we were talking about, I was going through the paper and I made some observations because actually in the late 70s, early 80s, I actually started donating blood on a regular basis to the Red Cross.
Oh,
And I remember in the early 80s, you still had all the standard questions about health and various other things that you had to check off. But it wasn't until I think it was about I want to say about 1984, 1985, is when suddenly these other questions started popping up about sexuality. And
yes,
if I remember correctly, it's because of the Red Cross had, their screening process had gotten a little careless, and there was some reports that some AIDS transmission had happened through the infected blood of donations. And so suddenly that's when those questions started showing up in the questionnaires, and they're still there. Even though
yes,
there is now some serious discussion about finally taking some of those questions off and opening up the donor pool again,
yes, yes,
which is probably just long overdue. But it's just that it's amazing how long it's taken, something
yeah.
like this to actually get to a point to where, uh, why couldn't there's lots of reasons why the Red Cross could not have been as adventurous and innovative as the Blood Sisters were, 40 years ago.
Right.
The
Yeah.
Red Cross was too big. The Blood
Yeah.
Sisters were just a small, decentralized group, probably, and they had the ability and the wisdom to see what needed to be done, and just went ahead and did it.
There also is the fact that the Red Cross was really involved with the federal government, and we have to keep in mind that the federal government was controlled by the Christian right,
Yeah,
and they were controlled by this narrative that really demonized queer people and really said, "Oh, they are to blame." And so when we talk about a lot about like these directed donation accounts or any kind of blood drives, during this time period, we have to keep in mind that these questions did start showing up in 1984, and they did start having that lasting effect that we see today, but that they were bound by the federal government. This is a statewide and federally mandated institution or policies and procedures that are happening. It is very much so that the government is very involved in how we collect blood and how we then give blood.
and you had mentioned early on about the idea of what I wrote down as queer solidarity. In other words, the queer men and queer women either getting along with each other or finding themselves at odds, as
Right.
as every group finds themselves at odds at one point in time. Something that Joe Hawkins told me was that, if I remember this correctly, and I could be putting out of context, is that because the death toll on men was so serious in say the first decade of the AIDS crisis, that when there were younger men, and he used the term younger men, it could have also applied to younger women who were coming out at that particular point in time. And that second generation that were starting to come out, they didn't have the street smarts, as Joe put it, as far as where was it safe to go, who was it safe to talk to, what was it safe to say, and those sorts of things, because there had always been these older men, at least in his interpretation, to kind of guide the up and coming through. And so suddenly that became part of there were women that started taking on that particular mother hen sort of role, I guess you want to describe it that way, which I would imagine was a role that a lot of them probably didn't anticipate, but maybe it came natural to a lot of them. I just found that particularly interesting, that there was a vacuum that was created, and again, the women stepped forward to fill that gap.
Yeah.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, a lot. I would agree with your with the gentleman who's told you that, because I think when we think about queer spaces, and George Chauncey in Gay New York talks a lot about this. He's pretty foundational work in understanding how spaces interact. Um, But when we think about queer spaces specifically, it's always under the guise of a dominant heteronormative space. So it's like it's a gym. A gym will have a straight space, a heteronormative space, which is the community area where everybody's working out. But then you take it into the showers and it suddenly becomes a gay space. It becomes that queerness. And so if you don't understand the different rules and the different communications that are happening, then you are going to get lost. You are going to face more direct discrimination because you're acting not within your space. You're putting a visual cue in somebody else's space. And that can be very dangerous. And it was very dangerous. There was also in the 1980s, though, there was a retreat from sexual liberation. There was a retreat from cruising. There was a retreat um, from being queer visibly because sexuality was to blame. I don't get too much to it into my presentation, but I talk a little bit about it in my paper. But there was a narrative being produced by dominant, kind of what we call now homonormative speakers who were leading the queer community at the time, and specifically leading the gay men's community, who were saying that sexual liberation is to blame for all of these deaths. Because we are so sexually liberated, because we have sex where we want to, when we want to, this is creating the negative aspects and the deaths within our community. And really queer women like Jenny Apuzzo and Cindy Patton were the ones who were saying, no, we actually need to return to that sexual liberation. And I wanted to highlight that in my paper a little bit more. But it is kind of a complicated web of many different interactions based on we have to be secret. We have to, as a queer community, we can't be the forefront. We have to be the one that's a little bit hidden. And so I think that's a really interesting two different points. So one, yes, we didn't necessarily have the same kind of leadership from older queer men, but the second aspect of that is um, the kind of sorry, the kind of retreat from sexual liberation. And within those kind of women who were pushing back and kind of leading the younger queer people coming out and the younger gay men, they are also pushing for sexual liberation. Because they're showing people how to, not necessarily how to cruise, but how to communicate those visual aspects and how to communicate with each other. That is reinforcing that sexual liberation. And so queer women were really the ones who get us over the edge there.
Great. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me.